This story comes from a book called Cold Case Christianity for Kids, which is written by a real-life police detective by the name of J. Warner Wallace. You can learn even more about how to think like a detective by going to his website, casemakersacademy.com. Jason isn't the only person who's starting to think like a detective. You and Hannah decide to examine the skateboard for more evidence. You peel up the edges of the gold sticker and discover the initials LB scratched on the board. Whose initials are those, you ask? I don't know, says Hannah. You decide to meet with Mr. Warren, the school janitor, who has worked at the school for 3 years. He's friendly and helpful, and you ask him about the old shed. Well, it was locked up for years, he says, after we moved our tools to the storage area in the new gym. Hannah asks, did you know the skateboard was in there? Mr. Warren nods. I almost forgot that thing. I heard about it from the janitors who worked here before me. There's a boy named Moses, gave it to Mr. Templeton. He was the first janitor of the school. And when he retired, he told the temporary janitor, Mr. Jenkins, about it. And Mr. Jenkins told me about it. I didn't really want to throw it away, and then one day a nice young lady asked if she could have it, so I gave it to her. And then sometime later, it appeared in the shed again. I guess she brought it back, and there it stayed until you guys found it. Daniel asks an important question. Mr. Warren, did you know that girl? What did she look like? Mr. Warren scratches his chin. I don't really remember, actually. I'm sorry. Hannah speaks up. Did the skateboard have the gold sticker on it when you first saw it? No, that must have been added by the girl who owned it last, he replies. The following Tuesday, you report what you've learned about the skateboard. Says Detective Jeffries. I think you're definitely onto something with the LB initials. You've also discovered something important that will help us answer Jason's question from last week about whether the Gospels were changed over time. So let's talk about this. It's called the chain of custody. What's that, you ask? The chain of custody is a record of who had the evidence and when they had it. It's kind of like a chain. Each person who has the evidence is a link in the chain. And you can see here that we have every person in the chain of who had the skateboard. Jeffrey steps up to the whiteboard again. So let's draw what we know. First of all, the skateboard belonged to Moses. Then he gave it to Mr. Templeton, who then gave it to Mr. Jenkins, who gave it to Mr. Warren, who then gave it to some girl who eventually put it back in the shed. Now we know everyone who had contact with the skateboard, and we even know when the sticker was added, right here, says Jeffries. Evelyn speaks up. Isn't the sticker the name of the school 9 years ago? Livingston? That must be a really old sticker. How come it was only put on there 2 or 3 years ago? Good question. Very good detective thinking, Evelyn. When we find the girl who put that sticker on there, we can ask her. But what might be the answer, do you think? Daniel says, maybe she just found an old sticker somewhere in her house. Jason agrees. Maybe she has an older brother or sister who got it when they were in the school. Yes, there must be a reasonable explanation like that. But one thing we know for sure, by the chain of custody, that the sticker was not there the first time Mr. Warren saw the skateboard, and he's only been there 3 years. Any other questions or comments? Jason looks confused. So how does this help answer my question about the Gospels about Jesus? He asks. Well, you were wondering if anything was added to the story of Jesus. If we could somehow trace the chain of custody of the Gospels, we could figure out who had contact with them and if anything was added. Well, can't we just look at the original copies to see what they say? Asks Hannah. Good question. Jeffries pulls up a chair next to the cadets. His long legs stick way out in front of him. This is a tough case because the original Gospels weren't like the skateboard. The skateboard can last a long time, but the original Gospels were not written on strong paper. They were written on something quite fragile called papyrus. It was a bit like paper, but it's not as strong as paper. It was good for writing on, but it wasn't so good for lasting. So we no longer have any of the originals, and that's why the chain of custody is so important. It can help tell us what the original Gospels said about Jesus. Jeffries stands up and returns to the whiteboard. Now let's draw a chain of custody about the Gospels, just to show you what I mean. He begins to draw ancient writers. Okay, let's start with the Apostle John. He wrote a book about Jesus called the Gospel of John. But what if there wasn't a single copy of John's original book around for us to read? And that's the case. We don't have the actual papyrus book that John wrote. It was just too fragile and crumbled apart after years of being handed around for people to read. After it was written and before it fell apart, John's book was hand copied onto other pieces of papyrus. But they were too fragile as well, and eventually they wore out and disappeared as well. But before they did, finally copies of the copies were made onto much stronger paper, and we can still see those paper copies today. Jason said, "Yes, but people could change what was written when they made a copy." Well, that's what's really interesting. There's a way for us to double check this. So can any of you think, how would we be able to double check what was in John's original book? The cadets remain silent. No one seems to know how to answer this question. All right, keep in mind we're going to draw a chain of custody, Jeffries reminds them. Evelyn speaks up. Did John pass on his teachings another way, maybe to other people? Now you're thinking, yes, John passed on his story of Jesus and all Jesus' teachings to his own disciples. He had 3 students in particular who can help us. Their names were Polycarp, Papias and Ignatius. These 3 men listened to everything John taught them about Jesus, and then they wrote their own letters describing the information they learned from John. These letters are not in your Bible, but they were preserved throughout history. Jason is starting to get it. So if I wanted to double check what John said about Jesus, I could read what these guys said that John told them and compare. Exactly, and that's not all. Ignatius and Polycarp then had a student themselves. His name was Ignatius, and he wrote about what he learned from his teachers, so we can compare the writings of John, Ignatius, Polycarp, Ignatius to see if anything's being added to the story of Jesus as time goes by. Wow, says Daniel. Oh, it's even better than that, continues Jeffries, now pacing back and forth in the front of the whiteboard. Ignatius had a student named Hippolytus who wrote about everything he learned from Ignatius, so we can look at all these letters and books to see if the story and description is the same in all of them, including copies of John's book. Jeffries compares the diagram for the skateboard with the diagram for the Gospels. Now look here on the skateboard, we know that the sticker was added to the skateboard based on the chain of custody, so we can work out who did it and when. And if we look at the Gospel chain of custody, we can answer Jason's question. Was there any change made? And what's the answer? Jason asks anxiously. When we read everything these men in the chain of custody had to say about what they learned along the way, we can see that nothing was added to the story of Jesus. Nothing? Asked Jason. Nothing. From the very beginning, Jesus was described the same way. His mother was virgin. He preached amazing sermons. He did incredible miracles. He died on a cross. He rose from the dead, and then he ascended up into heaven. All the miraculous stuff was there right from the beginning. It was not added later. Wow, that really makes you think, doesn't it? Jason says. Jeffries nods his head. You bet. And remember when we were talking about all the possible explanations for the resurrection a few weeks ago? Well, one of the explanations was that the story of the resurrection was added many years later, right? Yeah, I remember that, says Daniel. You never told us what you thought. Jeffries leans in toward the cadets. Well, now you know. The explanation that the resurrection was added in later is not reasonable due to the chain of custody. He sits down and looks at Jason. Keep searching. You're all going to discover the truth about the skateboard and the truth about Jesus. See you next week, everybody. This week we learnt a new skill as a detective, and it has the initials C of C. Do you know what it is? Tick, 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 tick. Yes, it's chain of custody. So you can write it on your detective toolbox right here. The chain of custody is all about who had the evidence and what did they say about it. If you don't have a detective toolbox sheet, you can download it using a link under this video. We also have a new definition, and it is about evidence tampering. Evidence tampering is when someone changes evidence so it is different to when it was first discovered. If you've missed a chapter, just go back on the church YouTube channel and you'll find any chapter you need there. You're becoming better at thinking like a detective. See you again soon.